Today, what's happening in New Zealand? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian and New Zealand flavour. And today I'm catching up briefly with Joe Wilkes before he heads off to Auckland.
Good morning, Martin. How are you?
Very good. So we got to Friday. Another week whizzes by.
Yeah, it's a big fast build up till Christmas now, isn't it?
Oh, it's terrible. I tell you what, I can't remember. The year has gone so quickly. It's just remarkable, really. But interestingly, the two posts that we did over the last week or so with regard to the Palmerston North got some quite interesting reactions.
Yeah, I think they seem to have been reasonably well received. A few people starting to question the narrative that we've been told in the press. I think the Tauranga post as well. We've had a few people looking at that, and it's interesting to get the comments and just read through them. Apologies that I can't respond to everybody who does make a comment. It's just the consequence of time, work, and family. But wherever I can, I'll try and dip in from time to time. I'd like to say thank you as well to Glenys, who has been kind enough to go to Patreon and make a note that she'd like to contribute $50 to petrol money for me to get out and about again. So with Glenys's contribution, I've decided I'll blow that immediately. And we'll take a trip up to Auckland and have a little look over there over the next few days. So might be a little bit of time for us to put something together on it. But Auckland seems to be the market that a lot of people are wanting to talk about. So I thought it'd be well worthwhile getting up there and spending a couple of days.
Okay, well, Auckland will be very interesting. And Joe, by the way, it was PayPal, not Patreon.
Oh, was it PayPal? Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Well, either way, thank you very much, Glenys. We'll blow that straight away, and we'll see if we can get some more footage.
And it's worth saying, we do really appreciate the support that we're getting from our audience. It really does make a huge difference in terms of our ability to be able to continue to do this stuff, because it does take time, effort, and money just to produce the shows. So it really is appreciated. And thank you very much for everyone who's contributed via PayPal or via Patreon, or even direct to me. I've had a few people send money direct as well. So, we do genuinely appreciate every contribution, and it is absolutely well received. We may not be able to thank every individual person simply because of the fact that, it's hard to do that. But we do absolutely appreciate every penny or any cent that's received. It really is tremendous.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll. Yeah, I think the New Zealand market is reacting at the moment. We've seen an upping of the mainstream media sponsorship of the property market. There've been quite a lot of articles. I find it incredible. We've got a lot of articles being released at the moment that are sort of still extolling the virtues of this the property investment game, which. I don't have anything wrong with property investment. I think you need to have landlords in the market. You need to have them providing a service. But what is quite interesting is that the upping of the pace of the promotion at a time when the market's starting to look a little bit wobbly.
Yeah, no, well, that's certainly interesting to get the hot off the press data. And talking about hot off the press data, I'll just share something with you, which I think you'll find quite relevant. In Australia, we've got this body called the Council of Financial Regulators, right, which is effectively the peak body that includes the Reserve Bank, ASIC, which is one of our regulators, APRA, which regulates the banks, and also the ACCC, the competition guys, and the ATO are also sitting around the table, right? Now, this shadowy organisation up until now has never actually made any public comments about anything. But for the first time, they put out a release after their quarterly meeting.
Right.
The most interesting point in the release was they're worried that banks aren't lending enough. So all of our major organisations in Australia are basically concerned that the credit impulse is weakening. And why? Because basically it's the only game in town, right? And it's exactly mirroring what we're seeing in New Zealand with regard to trying to keep that ball in the air a bit further. So we are sharing the same issue insofar that the only game in town, so far as the official fiefdom is concerned is to lend more. It was remarkable.
It sounds pretty much like it mirrors what Adrian Orr said a couple of weeks ago when he was saying the future of the housing market relies on those who want to step up and borrow. So yeah, and I think slowly people are starting to understand that the whole functioning of these Australasian economies, Australia and New Zealand, is about the year-on-year credit growth.
Yeah, it is about the debt bomb or about the expansion of credit. The trouble is, of course, that credit has to be repaid. And we're now getting to the point where effectively people's ability to repay that credit is in question, right? And it's worth underscoring again, of course, interest rates are ultra low at the moment. Right?
Yeah.
So if in fact rates would arise, as it is possible, I noticed that in Europe now the QE program in the Eurozone is being turned back, dialed off. So that will have an impact in raising interest rates there. We know that the US is likely to put rates up, and we know that the international funding costs are still rising. So all of that is going to put more pressure on funding costs locally. So unless the central banks in Australia and New Zealand effectively go into a rate cut cycle and QE cycle, in other words, just inflate asset prices yet again for no real reason other than just to keep the bubble going, we're going to see rates rise. So this is a very important inflection point, I think, in terms of people's understanding.
Yes, I mean it mirrors a lot of what I saw back in the UK in the end of the cycle 2008 all the way through to 2012, and it's not just about the regulators and the banks in terms of the cost of money. It's also about how they deal with the non-performing loans that they have on their books. And I'm just going to throw a couple of examples of what I saw in the UK when people were under stress. 2008, 9, 10, 11, we were seeing job losses. The market that I worked in, there were a lot of the employment was geared around city employment, and bonuses were trimmed. People had leveraged themselves up on the house when their incomes were very, very high in the bonus years of 2003 through to 2007. When jobs were lost or incomes were reduced in that period post the GFC, I used to sit down in people's living rooms and hear about their situation where there was a shortfall of a couple of £1,000s a month on the mortgage, and the pressure that was putting them under. So many had a buffer, but that buffer was a 3-month buffer, a 6-month buffer, a 9-month buffer. And as we went through this process, and some of these people were unable to find jobs, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months on. What was really interesting was how the banks then dealt with their debt positions. It wasn't uncommon for somebody who'd had a 25-year loan, all of a sudden to talk to the bank, and the bank would say, "Okay, don't worry about it. Don't worry about the repayment side of it. We'll switch you over to interest only, and we'll extend your term until you've got yourself sorted out." So the banks have lots of ways of easing the debt pressure, and I think that they will use these tools if we do see a reduction in the total lending, or if we see that easing of the credit impulse. They will start to use their own extraordinary measures to try and ease people and prevent having to put houses that are carrying bad debt back into the market to facilitate further price falls. I read an article a few weeks ago, which was talking it's about by Michael Burry, who was the guy who's from The Big Short, and he shorted the housing market in the GFC, and he was interviewed in 2011 and said that the way that the American housing market didn't fall off a cliff was because a lot of the houses that were suffering in terms of households being able to repay debt, they were basically given a debt holiday. Many of them were continuing to live in the properties without paying anything on them, because at the period of 2011, 12, 13, the market was still depressed, and it wouldn't have made sense for the banks to release those properties back into the market. They did later. They put them back on the market when prices were starting to recover 14, 15, 16s. If households hadn't got themselves back into shape, when the asset prices have started going back up again, that's when they're releasing into the market. So um, I don't know how this is going to play out, but I have seen the behaviour of banks in the UK, and read about how the banks dealt with this in the States at the end of a end of the credit cycle. Um, will they do in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, where post GFC prices have doubled again, and that's I think the big unknown for me, and for lots of people who are looking at this and thinking, well, how do we work all this out? Will these assets, where there is distress, if it comes later, how will they be dealt with? Will they be put back into a market to provide further stock to lower prices further? I think we're not seeing anything like that in New Zealand at the moment. We're still behind the curve. I don't think that we'll. I don't know what's going to happen. Whether we're going to have a market that like Sydney's seen 9 or 10% come off in 2018. Whether we're going to see that happen in 2019, just can't tell. But what I do know is that there seems to be pressure systems, and households seem to be finding things tighter.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The data here, which I published yesterday, showed that in fact the banks now, particularly the big banks, about 6% of the loans that they've written in the last quarter were outside standard serviceability, which is higher than it's been. So if you go back 18 months or so, it was down at 1%, right?
Yes.
So whilst they are tightening their lending conditions overall, they're still breaking their own rules a lot more. And if you delve into that, what you discover is that some of those people are the ones who are actually in more difficulty. So effectively, the banks are showing a willingness to break their own rules to keep people borrowing, particularly those who are struggling. That's the first point. The second point is, you're absolutely right. In a falling market, with people who are in difficulty, the last thing the banks will do will be to foreclose en masse. The reason is that all that will do will put more downward pressure on home prices and on effectively the economy. So they are sort of stuck. And so effectively what they will do is they will find various means to be able to actually sort of keep the bubble going for longer, hoping that perhaps prices will recover. And in Australia, we have a thing called hardship arrangement. So if you do get into difficulty and you go and talk to your lender, they actually have a legal obligation to try and assist, which generally means restructuring the loan, maybe even, as you say, switching to interest only or some other mechanism to be able to take the repayments lower whilst people sort themselves out. So effectively, we've got wired into our system here a whole bunch of stuff to try and keep the debt bomb ticking over, even in a downturn, right? But what amazes me, and people still haven't got their head around this, is even now we have got housing credit growing at more than 5% per annum, when the debt to income ratio is 190, which is almost a world high.
Yours is off the scale, yeah.
Yeah, which is remarkable.
Ours is still growing at 6% per annum.
Yeah, which sort of tells you that this debt impulse and the housing thing, it is still alive and well and is still stoking the system, right?
Yeah. I read an article that's provided by one of our commentators who got in touch with me directly, and I really do appreciate people who are, making comments, getting involved, talking to me on LinkedIn, because you provide some really helpful data. But yeah, the mainstream press is still pushing the narrative of getting the first-time buyers in. We know that 43% of lending in New Zealand last year was household income to debt ratios of over 5 times, 25% of it over 6 times. Over in the Hawke's Bay, which is out on the east coast, south of Tauranga, where I visited a few weeks ago, the Hawke's Bay sales in October, 27% of those sales were to first-time buyers, who are again fueling the funnel of this credit growth. So the press. They will carry on. They'll carry on as long as they can, and I think you've only just seen it 12 months after prices started to fall in Sydney. The mainstream media now talking about it, and providing. You've got to provide the story so that people can make the right decisions.
Well, it's interesting. So there was a three-part series here in Australia on the ABC this week, which effectively went through how we got to where we got to, the current lending standards, and they also touched on negative gearing, right? And that's really the first time that I think the mainstream media has really tried to analyse this in a little more detail. I have to say that there was absolutely nothing new in those three stories for anybody who's been watching the DFA channel, because we've been covering this for 3 or 4 years. But it was interesting that the atmospherics do seem to be turning, and effectively more people are now here in Australia are saying, there are issues. And yet that is precisely at the point at which the main authorities, the RBA, APRA, etc., are actually reasserting the importance of borrowing, reasserting the need for credit. So you can almost see the offsetting discussions going on, right? So as the more that we talk about issues, the more that the authorities try and talk up the importance of lending, and of course in the context of the Royal Commission, which is still working through their final report at the moment. So you can see this thing literally in play, in action every day here now.
Yeah, well, our Reserve Bank are going to be reporting in December. So middle of December, they're going to be reporting on what their investigations into the financial markets has been, which is good. That's a positive, and hopefully we'll hear about that in the mainstream press as well. The Reserve Bank are also asking for more staff, which I think is a positive, because I think that they really do need some more support to go in and be able to help fine-tooth comb what's going on in the financial system, because I think that many reserve banks worldwide, and Bank of England, we know, is no different. They didn't have the manpower, didn't really understand what's going on in the banking system. That's great. Unfortunately, that request has been denied so far. I find it quite interesting over in New Zealand. I don't know what the situation is in Australia, but our Reserve Bank paid a dividend to the government's Crown accounts of 430 billion this year. Is that the same in Australia?
Yeah, I don't know what the dividend is this year, but yeah, certainly last year the Reserve Bank did pay an amount back to the Treasury basically at the end of the year, and they have done consistently for a little while now. So that does seem to be part of the. And it's because of their so-called market operations, right? So basically they're buying and selling assets and those sorts of things and taking positions and what have you, yeah. So yes, they do actually put a contribution back into Treasury. And by the way, it's worth saying that in Australia, the Reserve Bank is not a privately owned entity like it is in the US, right? So in the US, the Feds are actually private. They're not owned by the government. They're not, in Australia, and I'm not sure about New Zealand, you can talk in a second, but in Australia, the Reserve Bank is effectively a government entity. It's, to that extent, funded by its operations. It has a mandate from the government with regard to inflation, employment, and to safeguard, if you like, the well-being of Australians overall. I mean, that's its mandate, right? And that comes from the government, right? Yeah. And then from there, it's meant to be independent, although how independent it is, given the fact they've got this Council of Financial Regulators where they all sit around the table, including the Treasury, begs an interesting question, right? But that's how it works. And then they basically pass a little bit of money back.
Yeah, sounds like a very similar situation here with the RBNZ. So the RBNZ, unfortunately, aren't able to get more staff here, despite returning this massive dividend to the Crown, or the Crown accounts. And yet they want to. I read an article yesterday. They're talking about going off and studying the impact of climate on housing prices.
Interesting.
Haven't yet got to the bottom of the banks.
Long bow, possibly. I mean, it's worth saying, of course, that if in fact sea levels rise, and people are talking about consistently higher sea levels as ice melts, that could have a very significant impact on coastal properties. And a lot of properties, certainly in Australia and I suspect in New Zealand, are around the coast and actually quite low lying. So there definitely are some risks there in terms of medium to long term. Plus, of course, I suppose you can also think about the greater storm damage. And we had massive storms here overnight, huge thunderstorms, huge amounts of water, and they're forecasting more over the next few days. And we're actually seeing a greater preponderance of bigger storms and creating more damage. So that could have, so you can see that there are significant impact points potentially on on the property sector and on the economy, right? And I guess there's a interesting question as to what extent these sorts of issues are directly related or indirectly related to climate change. But of course, it's a very long bow, isn't it, between what climate change is and how it works and what the impact might be on the property market and on the economy.
And then also you have the Ministry of Environment to deal with that impact. So it seems to me that they're struggling for resources, and they obviously want more. The last interview that I saw with our regulated body in the RBNZ, you could tell by the body language that they have they recognise that there's an issue, but they're not yet quite sure what the extent of the issue might be. So
sure.
We'll get a good report hopefully next month, and so middle of December. Look forward to seeing that. My investigations will continue, so I'll head up to Auckland in the meantime, and we're going to have a little look at what's going on there.
And we're going to try and get a better microphone, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We'll sort that. We'll sort that.
Yeah, because one of the comments people made on the last 2 or 3 was great to see the pictures, but we can't really hear much of what Joe's saying because the audio is pretty bad.
It's been tough. Tauranga, it was incredibly wet and windy when I went up there, and when I was out in Palmerston North the other day. The wind was phenomenal. It was good that it had blown the clouds away, but the wind was quite strong. So yeah, I'll do my very best to improve that tech, and I promise I won't get you in trouble with singing Kenny Rogers next time.
Well, I had I thought that with you singing along, and frankly singing along not particularly well, that it would probably mask it sufficiently that the algorithms wouldn't pick it up. But blow me, they picked it up immediately. So, and so I got pinged on the copyright thing. So that's why I took it down, and then just overlaid some other music that I had. So that was the story there. It's one of those things. The YouTube algorithms these days are remarkable at identifying copyrighted material. So that's why we have to be quite careful, because if you do too much of that, you get pinged, and then you can't put more posts up. So it's pretty important that we protect the integrity.
We all want more of your posts, so I won't.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I took a little bit of a draconian step, which was okay. We'll take this down and then repost it, which is
brilliant.
Okay, Joe. So it's really good talking to you, and I hope that the Auckland weather is kind to you. I have to say that your video in the rain was quite well received, but you did like a drowned rat. So let's hope the weather's good. And have you noticed how many people comment on the bad weather in New Zealand?
Yeah, I know, and it's only the 2 days that I've been out that it's been rubbish recently. It's been absolutely glorious, apart from those 2 days in the last 2 weeks. So, no, the weather in New Zealand is generally fantastic, apart from when I go out filming. Okay,
so you obviously have your own personal rain cloud.
Yeah, I think it must be it's followed me over from the UK.
Okay. Well, I hope you have a good trip around, and we'll look forward to seeing some of those shots later on. And really appreciate your time today, and have a good weekend.
Good to see you, Martin.
Thanks, Joe.
Take care. Bye-bye.
So there we are. It'll be interesting to see what Joe finds in Auckland, and looking at specifically the types of developments in and around the place. If you like what you've seen here today, please share the post and like the post. Add a comment or question. We do read them all. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.